It's with great pleasure that I'm going to be introducing our speaker tonight. He is Carlton Mayers, founder and owner of Mayers Strategic Solutions. He is a lawyer and a graduate of Vermont Law School and Emory University. He was the Supervising Field Director in the Criminal Justice Program at the Southern Poverty Law Center. He directed the National Criminal Justice Reform Program at the NAACP National Office in Baltimore and co-authored the NAACP publication Born Suspect Racial Profiling Report, published in 2014. There will be a Q&A after his talk. He will speak on decarceration through a community-oriented criminal justice system. Let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Mayers.
Hello and good evening. Thank you for having me here. It's truly an honor. It's been quite some time since I've been a lecturer at a church. Back in the day, I was when I was at my Catholic church. I used to be a lecturer there as well, in addition to being an altar boy. And so it's been a while since I've been in this position. It's great, though. I love it. Really feeling it. So yes, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today, especially the Q&A section once we get to it. But all right, let's just get started then. So as was just said, I'm here to speak on decarceration through a community-oriented criminal justice system. What I'm going to do is I'm framing today's conversation through a historical context. And with that said, my mother used to always tell me that life consists of cycles of things that have occurred in the past and that tend to reoccur again in the future, but just in a different form. And so I want to just put that out there so that way you keep that in mind through the presentation. You'll see how that's relevant. All right, so let's get started. All right, so we're going to start off with what I will call Reconstruction period era, which was right after the American Civil War. So this is policing following the Civil War, 1865 to 1877, the birth of the Black Codes and enforcement of vagrancy laws. The Black Codes, sometimes called Black Laws, were laws governing the conduct of freed African Americans. The best known of them were passed in 1865 and 1866 by Southern states after the American Civil War and the beginning of the Reconstruction period, in order to restrict African Americans' freedom and to compel them to work for low wages. Before the war, northern states that had prohibited slavery also enacted Black Codes to discourage free African Americans from residing in those states. They were denied equal political rights, including the right to vote, sounds familiar, the right to attend public schools, and the right to equal treatment under the law. Some of the northern states repealed such laws around the same time that the Civil War ended, and slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. Black codes were essentially the replacements for slave codes in those states. Since the colonial period, colonies and states had passed laws that discriminated against free African Americans. In the South, these were generally included in slave codes. The goal was to reduce the influence of free African Americans because of their potential influence on slaves. Restrictions included prohibiting them from voting, once again sounds familiar, bearing arms, gathering in groups for worship, and learning to read and write. The purpose of these laws was to preserve slavery in slave societies. In the first 2 years after the Civil War, white-dominated Southern legislatures passed black codes modeled after the earlier slave codes. They were particularly concerned with controlling movement and labor of freed men, as slavery had been replaced by a free labor system. Although freed men had been emancipated, their lives were greatly restricted by the black codes. The defining feature of the black codes was broad vagrancy laws, including loitering, which allowed local authorities to arrest freed people for minor infractions and commit them to involuntary labor. This period was the start of the convict lease system, which was a system of penal labor practiced in the South and overwhelmingly targeted African American men. Convict leasing provided prison labor to private parties such as plantation owners. These owners were responsible for feeding, clothing, and housing their prisoners. Now, as you can see here on the slide, there's a picture of several African American men dressed up in jail garb or prison garb. And the bottom it says convicts who had violated the black codes. So these were freed black men that were freed after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the American Civil War, and were then incarcerated because they were considered to have violated the black codes. And so now what they're doing is essentially they're now working on the plantation again, this time instead of being slaves as prisoners. So a good example, let's say you have an African American male back at this time who's free, just standing around. Officer comes over, sees them, they're like, you're loitering. That's a violation. You're under arrest. Now we're gonna arrest you for loitering, and now you're gonna have to pay your debt to society for that violation. Now, typically they're not able to afford to pay it back because of the situation they were in at that time. So what they would have to do is work to pay back that debt. And that's why they would place them on the plantation, to work off their debt. However, if they have another violation of the rules of the plantation while they're there, well then now you have more money you have to pay off. So now you have to work even longer to pay off an even larger debt. Ultimately, this individual could end up dying on that plantation as a free African American, but on the same plantation potentially that they were enslaved in and their family was enslaved in during slavery. And so this is what was happening with the convict lease system. I'm going to move up a little bit more and I'm going to kind of bring it into Florida a bit. Civil rights movement in Jim Crow, 1940 to 1965, the Groveland Four. I know some of you here probably are familiar with that story, but I'm going to talk about that a bit. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the South. All were enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by white Democratic-nominated state legislatures after the Reconstruction period. The laws were enforced until 1965. In practice, Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in all public facilities in the states of the former Confederate States of America and other states, starting in the 1870s and 1880s. Jim Crow laws were upheld in 1896 in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the U.S. Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal legal doctrine for facilities for African Americans. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education reversed this legal doctrine and ended racial segregation. The Groveland Four, three African American men seen up there, or the Groveland Boys, were four young African American men: Ernest Thomas, Charles Greenlee, then a minor at age 16, Samuel Shepard, and Walter Irvin, who in 1949 were accused of raping a 17-year-old white girl, Norma Paget, and assaulting her husband on July 16th of 1949 in Lake County, Florida. Ernest Thomas fled and was killed by a sheriff's posse on July 26th of 1949 in South Madison County, and Greenlee, Shepard, and Irvin were arrested. They were beaten to coerce confessions, but Urban refused to confess. The 3 survivors were convicted at trial by an all-white jury. Greenlee was sentenced to life because he was the only one who was 16 years old at the time of the crime. The other 2 were sentenced to death. In November of 1951, Sheriff Willis B. McCall, who you see there, the tall gentleman on the left-hand side with the glasses, looking at the 3 African-American gentlemen, of Lake County, Florida, shot Urban and Shepard while they were in his custody, killing Shepard and seriously wounding Urban. It was alleged that they had tried to escape while he was transporting them to their new trial. Shepard died on the spot. Urban survived his wounds and later told FBI investigators that the sheriff had shot them in cold blood and that his deputy had also shot him in an attempt to kill him. Ultimately, Urban was represented by Thurgood Marshall, Special Counsel of NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And in 1968, he was paroled, but died the next year in Lake County from natural causes. Greenlee, who was 16 years old when the incident occurred, had been paroled in 1962 and lived with his family until he died in 2012. In 2016, the city of Groveland and Lake County each apologized to the survivors of the 4 men for the injustice against them. The 4 were posthumously exonerated on April 18th of 2017 by a resolution of the Florida House of Representatives. The state Senate quickly passed a similar resolution, and then in January of 2019, the Florida Board of Executive Clemency voted to pardon the Groveland 4, and Governor Ron DeSantis subsequently did so. So there has been some justice in this case, but this is a clear example of Jim Crow here in Florida. This is a big case, and when I worked at Legal Defense Fund, Sherman Eiffel and others always brought up this case because it was a good example of the good work that Thurgood Marshall did, especially in the South, around these injustices. Okay, moving on. Move on to something a bit more modern. Lyndon B. Johnson administration, War on Crime, 1963 to 1969. President Johnson's War on Crime and War on Poverty suggested more investments in education and health, but not in law enforcement. But President Johnson's administration also provided federal funding to help state and local law enforcement create more professional departments and fight crime through the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. Has anybody here ever heard of the term officer friendly? Yeah. Right. That came from Lyndon B. Johnson and from the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. The whole point of it was to professionalize law enforcement and have them have that level of engagement with communities where you had an officer in your community that you knew, they were friends with you, you can go to them and report crimes, all that good stuff. So that's what happened under his presidency. Now we're going to move on to what happened after. Law and Order and War on Drugs, 1960 to 1993. Country experienced a crime increase from 1960 to 1993 for complex reasons. President Richard Nixon and other politicians who opposed civil rights gains associated the rise in crime with lawlessness by civil rights demonstrators. Policymakers used crime increase as an opportunity to pass tougher criminal laws, or what we would call tough on crime laws, at the state and federal levels, particularly drug laws, such as the mandatory minimum sentencing laws. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, which have been disproportionately applied to black people. We'll move ahead now. 1994. The Violent Crime Control Act and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. And I know everybody here has heard about this law because it comes up so much during the presidential elections. So this law is signed into law by President Bill Clinton and was drafted by none other than Senator Biden. What this law did, it systematized so-called tough on crime policies in the U.S. You remember those tough on crime laws from President Richard Nixon? Yeah, it was systematized. under President Bill Clinton. States and localities were incentivized through a massive infusion of federal funding to build more jails and prisons and pass so-called truth in sentencing laws, which here in Florida is called the 85% rule law. We'll talk about that in a minute. And other punitive measures that simultaneously increase the number and length of prison sentences while reducing the possibility of early release for those incarcerated. The 1994 Crime Bill accelerated U.S. prison boom by authorizing more than $12 billion to subsidize the construction of state correctional facilities, giving priority to states that enacted so-called truth in sentencing laws. These laws, which require individuals to serve at least 85% of their sentence behind bars, have been shown to expand prison populations by increasing individuals' length of stay. And I can tell you right now from the work I did at Southern Poverty Law Center, that research has shown that the #1 driving force behind mass incarceration in Florida is the current 85% rule law that I'm talking about right now, that stems from back in 1994, which also was a manifestation of the tough on crime laws from back in the 60s. Remember I talked to you earlier about cycles? Things keep on coming up, but they manifest in a different form. You're starting to see that. It even goes back to the black codes and the slave codes I mentioned earlier. It just keeps coming back. So, and the whole point is that keeping people like nonviolent offenders locked up for a much longer period of time than is necessary. That is ultimately what the 85% rule does. Just keeps people locked up for longer periods of time and it bloats the incarceration system, because people are not leaving. This law resulted in a staggering amount of taxpayer dollars that were invested in enforcement, but also from a disproportionate incarceration of a generation of African American men in the name of public safety. Moreover, tough on crime measures, specifically longer incarceration sentences, have had at best a marginal effect on improving public safety. So it doesn't even work. Locking people up just to lock them up. The tragic terrorist acts that occurred on September 11th of 2001 resulted in an expansion of profiling by law enforcement of underrepresented communities such as Black and brown communities, Muslim communities, South Asian and Middle Eastern communities, and LGBTQ. This was the beginning of an increase in discriminatory enforcement activities, such as stop and frisk, zero tolerance policing, and the broken windows approach. And for those who don't know what the broken windows approach is, the concept behind it is that the best way to prevent large-scale, severe crimes like murder is to go after people that commit low-level crimes, like for instance, urinating in public, walking around with a bottle, an alcoholic beverage that's not sealed. If you go after them then and incarcerate them at that time, then that will deter them from committing more severe crimes in the future. It does not work. And if you think about it, what does that sound like? Exactly, the Jim Crow, the black codes, you know, using like vagrancy laws such as loitering, just standing around. Oh yeah, you're a violation of the law, we're now going to incarcerate you. Minor infractions, using that as a reason to incarcerate people of color and other individuals from vulnerable communities. Something good to note though is that prior to 9/11, there were several federal and state initiatives to ban profiling by law enforcement, but these efforts were undone when September 11th occurred. And now we're going to get to what I will call the new era, President Obama's administration. So President Obama's criminal justice reforms, 2008 to 2016. In 1973, U.S. federal and state prisons detained 200,000 adults. By 2009, that number had swelled to 1.5 million, with further 700,000 serving time for local felonies. amounting to a total of 2.23 million adults within the U.S. incarceration system. To address this mass incarceration, President Obama implemented several initiatives. For example, the Clemency Project allowed for non-violent, low-level offenders without significant ties to large-scale criminal organizations, gangs, and cartels to get their sentences commuted or shortened, therefore allowing them to leave prison earlier. President Obama commuted more than 1,000 sentences through this initiative. There's also the 21st Century Policing Task Force Report, which is a publication on policing reform produced by an 11-member task force on the 21st century's policing, and was created by an executive order issued by President Obama in 2015, which included academics, law enforcement officials, and civil rights activists to respond to a number of serious incidents between law enforcement and the communities that they serve and protect. In addition to that, President Obama's administration aggressively implemented the U.S. Department of Justice's pattern and practice investigations of unconstitutional activities by law enforcement departments such as discriminatory policing and excessive use of force. And we saw this in Chicago, Ferguson, and in Baltimore. All of these reforms resulted in policing reform on the state and local levels. Then, in regards to assisting people with criminal records who are returning to the community, President Obama established the Federal Interagency Reentry Council to lead the government's work on the rehabilitation and reintegration of individuals returning to their communities from prisons and jails. This consisted of federal agencies such as the Housing and Urban Development Office and the U.S. Department of Justice. Lastly, there was the My Brother's Keeper initiative, which was an interagency effort to improve measurably the expected educational and life outcomes for and address the persistent opportunity gaps faced by boys and young men of color. And so, as you can see with the President Obama's administration, there was a change in the way that the U.S. criminal justice system was functioning. Instead of trying to build up and continue to lock people up and keep them locked up over extensive amounts of time, especially vulnerable populations, President Obama implemented initiatives to try to reduce those numbers. He didn't try to do it quickly, but he did try to do it gradually. So let's talk about what's happening now. The current era. I hear some growls. What's going on? I feel like I did something wrong. What happened? All right, so the U.S. criminal justice system in contemporary times. While the DOJ's original truth in sentencing incentive program has lapsed, the federal government continues to subsidize the growth of correctional facilities. In fact, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has spent at least $360 million to build jails in rural communities using funds from a grant and loan program that was originally intended for rural economic development and infrastructure improvements. Now, why do you think they did that? Because what they were doing was creating an incarceral system within a local community so that that local community would be completely and solely dependent economically on that system. Now, I've seen this when I lived in Tallahassee. If you just drive a little bit toward the east, going toward Jefferson County in Monticello, or even Madison County, you literally see these communities that are completely dependent and completely revolve around corrections and law enforcement. Most of the people that live there have some job that contributes to that system. So if that system were to not exist there, their whole economy would go under. And that's due to these kind of bills that are passed through federal funding to these localities to create these correctional facilities and keep them strong and ongoing. And so, according to the Prison Policy Initiative, While more than 600,000 people enter U.S. prisons each year, the nation's annual jail turnover is 10.6 million. What that means is that mass incarceration as it looks now is not about people getting incarcerated in prisons so much, like state prisons and federal prisons, but it's more so about people getting incarcerated in jails. Local jails are actually accumulating more people that are incarcerated than prisons. And this is what's happening now. Jails run by local law enforcement and are designed to hold inmates awaiting trial or serving a short-term sentence. The nation's annual short-term sentence, while prisons are generally state or federally run, holding inmates who are convicted of more serious offenses. Most individuals locked up in American jails have not yet been convicted. Also, private industry has permeated virtually every sector of the criminal justice operations. Every year, bail bondsmen collect $1.4 billion in non-refundable fees from defendants and their families. Private vendors earn $1.6 billion selling goods in prison commissaries. And telephone companies collect $1.3 billion in exorbitant fees for calls prisoners make to their loved ones and lawyers. These facilities are obsolete today. Considering the United States' current low crime rate, yet jurisdictions see an opportunity to create jobs through the criminal justice system. The construction of new prisons and jails incentivizes governments to make use of them, thereby encourages criminalization. From 2000 to 2016, the number of people held in private prisons jumped by 47%, 5 times faster than the overall growth in incarceration. America's 2 largest private prison companies, Geo Group Inc., which is headquartered here in Florida, and the Core Civic, formerly known as Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, amassed more than $3 billion in revenue per year, roughly half of which comes from the federal government. The vast majority of the remaining revenue comes from lucrative contracts with state governments, which often include a guarantee that states will incarcerate enough people to fill the prison. Under a number of these agreements, states must pay a fee if the prison population dips below the quota, which is usually set at 90% of the prison's total capacity, creating clear incentives for states to lock more people up for longer periods of time. And Florida is one of the top states in the country to have contracts with for-profit prisons. I believe all of the juvenile correction facilities in Florida are privately run. Every single one of them. So furthermore, private industry is undermining efforts to reduce reliance on incarceration by monetizing the use of community supervision. I know that a lot of people have talked about probation being a good alternative to incarceration. In other words, allowing people to serve their sentence outside in public so they can stay with their families, but they have to wear like a wrist band or some kind of ankle bracelet to monitor where they're at and what they're doing. And they'll have a probation officer that meets with them on a regular basis to make sure that they're adhering to their sentence. Now, considering that, a private electronic monitoring company in California, for example, collects more than $750 in monthly fees from every individual on supervision who wears a monitoring device. So these are individuals who are already impoverished, they were incarcerated, their families don't have resources like that, and now they're out in society wearing an ankle bracelet, and they have to pay $750 a month for wearing it, for serving their time. Remember we talked about the black codes? Paying off your debt. How that debt tends to accumulate and accrue while you're incarcerated or while you're working, so you never get out of it. You're always working until the day you die, or you're always incarcerated until you die, which essentially is slavery. This model not only expands the scope of mass supervision, but it is also designed to keep people trapped in a cycle of justice involvement. Anyone who is unable to afford the steep cost of electronic monitoring can expect to end up in jail, regardless of the nature of the alleged offense. So this speaks to debtors' prisons, and the criminalization of poverty, in which poor people, are not able to afford fines and fees and bail. And because of that, civil fines and fees and bail, not even criminal. And because of that, they are, as a result, incarcerated for not making payment. It's a debtor's prison. It's supposed to be unconstitutional, but happens every day all around the country. Additionally, for-profit prisons are detaining adult and children immigrants caught at the U.S.-Mexico border. I know that from the work I've done at Southern Poverty Law Center that there is I believe, a for-profit prison contract with a detention facility in Homestead, Florida. And that's where they are currently sending some of the immigrants from the border. And so, I mean, like I said, Florida is embedded with for-profit companies that do this work. So this is very relevant to the state. Now, speaking of warrior-style policing, the default solution is to call on law enforcement to respond to any issue that has the potential to affect a community's safety. Whether it is substance misuse and addiction, mental health issues, truancy, or homelessness. In almost every situation, law enforcement's main tool is the power to arrest and incarcerate, thereby unnecessarily enlarging the criminal justice system, simply because other solutions or responses are not available. Requiring law enforcement apparatus to solve societal issues that is neither trained nor equipped to handle overburdens the justice system. All of this that I just talked about, all of these are synonymous with the black codes and the convict lease system, especially when we're talking about for-profit prisons and the money that they make and continue to make off of poor, vulnerable people, just like the black codes. Ultimately, public safety depends exclusively and primarily on police and the criminal justice system. Now, we can't talk about this without talking about the elephant in the room: school to prison pipeline. So I know here it says at least 2.3 million, but that number's changed a bit. I'm going to say something more accurate. Just under 2.3 million people are behind bars right now in the United States of America. And I've already explained to you that a good chunk of that number are people who are incarcerated in jails and have not even been convicted yet. The U.S. is 5% of the world's population, however, 25% of the world's incarcerated population. $70 billion spent annually on corrections and law enforcement. Increasing allocations of funds on prison system versus education. Excessive spending on prisons undermines state spending on education. The overlap between low-performing schools and high incarceration areas. Once again, this results in the school-to-prison pipeline. So what does that look like? Well, state and government expenditure on prisons and jails has increased 3 times as fast as spending on schools since 1990, according to a 2016 report from the U.S. Department of Education. Data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics show that 2/3 of state prison inmates have not completed high school. About half, or a little bit more than that, about half. While young black men between the ages of 20 and 24 who do not possess a high school diploma or equivalent qualification have a higher chance of being imprisoned than employed. In 2016, the Department of Education released data showing that African American students in the United States are arrested significantly more than their white classmates. Once arrested, black males are more likely to be convicted. Once convicted, they are more likely to face stiff sentences. The Bureau of Justice Statistics has found that 1 in 3 black men will go to prison in their lifetime. Like I said, cycles coming up again. Different manifestations, but the same thing. Racial disparity in the criminal justice system. Relative to white people, black people receive longer sentences for the same crimes, are treated more disrespectfully by police in routine interactions, and are more likely to be shot by police during confrontation. And we've seen this on people's camera photos, so it's not like it's just stories that people are telling. We've actually seen this. Black people are overrepresented in the nation's incarcerated population and make up 37% of this population, even though black people make up only 13% of the overall general population in the U.S. So 37% of the incarcerated population, but 13% of the overall population. That is a great racial disparity. Some good news though, mass incarceration peaked during the years of 2007 and 2008 and has been quietly but consistently falling ever since. So we are seeing a reduction in numbers. And I do want to say something, 2007, 2008 was right around the time that somebody came into office too. And according to the Pew Research Center, the overall incarceration rate is now at a 20-year low. So mass incarceration is getting smaller. So that's some good news. It's not happening quickly, it's not happening in great numbers, but it is happening. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, comparing 2017 survey results with prior years shows that African American male imprisonment rate has declined by 1/3 since its peak and is now at a level not seen since 1991. So that's really good news. But what's happening with black women who are in prison? Let's find out. African American women's rate of imprisonment has dropped 57% from its peak and is now at a 30-year low. Meanwhile, violent crime, despite a troubling uptick in 2015 and 2016, has not reverted to the out-of-control rates of the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Despite recent decreases, the U.S. still incarcerates more people in absolute numbers and as a share of our population than any other nation on this planet. So even with the decline in the numbers, we are still number one. Which, I mean, I know America's big on being number one, but I don't think we want to be that number one. There's other number ones that I think are better to be. So, beyond talking about what happens to people while they're incarcerated, or even talking about what happens at the beginning of the criminal justice system, when people are engaging with law enforcement, what happens after people serve their time? Right? They've done their time, and now they're ready to come back home and to become a gainful, contributing citizen of society. Well, let's see what happens. At least 700,000 people return home from prisons and jails every year. They face collateral consequences, or what some people might call lifelong punishments, such as loss of public housing benefits, employment barriers, cannot sit on juries. In many states, wink wink, voting rights, and parental rights. This has been called the new Jim Crow, which is the name of Michelle Alexander's acclaimed book, which describes how mass incarceration is metaphorically the new Jim Crow. And what I want to say about this is that this is the new Jim Crow. Once again, looking at cycles, it's another manifestation of the same thing. Because when you look at back what the original Jim Crow laws were back in the 60s, it's very similar, but a different way of doing it. And then what was that based on? The black codes and the vagrancy laws. What was that based on? The slave codes during slavery. It's the same thing, but just a different form, different manifestation of it. Now, we can't talk about criminal justice reform without talking about the death penalty. Racial disparities in the death penalty in the U.S. criminal justice system. African Americans are 41% of death row inmates, even though African Americans make up, once again, only 13% of the overall U.S. population. Once again, racial disparity. Receiving death penalty linked to victim's race. 75% on death row murdered a white person. Now, there have been a lot of studies showing that if you have somebody who's murdered a white person, more than likely they're going to get the death row sentence. But if it's somebody who's murdered a person of color, more than likely they're just going to get life in prison. A lot of studies have shown this. The death penalty is a flawed system. Why? Well, since 1973, more than 150 people have been exonerated based on innocence through DNA testing. I'm sure people have heard of the Innocence Project. They've done great work. It's been documented, a lot of documentaries about the work they've done. If anybody likes to binge watch stuff on Netflix, that's a good place to find it. The death penalty is not a deterrent, and we've seen that over the years. It's been implemented, but violent crimes are still happening. I mean, look at all the mass shootings that have happened ever since. It's not stopping crime. It's not stopping people from picking up a gun and gunning down people, even in churches. You've seen that. It's a fact. Also, the death penalty does not consider people who suffer from severe mental illness. And the European Union has put a moratorium or a ban on pharmaceutical drugs being exported from European Union countries to the U.S. to be used for the sole purpose for death penalty, to execute people. And the reason being that the EU countries have already abolished the death penalty. But we have not. And because those drugs are not as easy to access as they were years ago, what's been happening is that a lot of states are considering reverting back to old school techniques of execution, such as the electric chair and the rifle squad. And I want to say possibly Utah rifle squad, and definitely Tennessee electric chair. Now, the black African American gentleman you're looking at in that picture, if y'all don't recognize him, that's a gentleman named Troy Davis. He was executed in Georgia some years ago for allegedly killing a police officer, a white police officer. Even though the interviews and the stories of the people who gave evidence or gave stories to say that he committed the crime were inconsistent, and the evidence was not consistent. He was still executed, and there was a huge effort to try to stay his execution or stop it. And at the end of the day, he was executed anyway. And more than likely, he was innocent of the crime. So, I know I've been kind of like talking about some bad news with you all, so I want to try to lighten things up a bit. But the reason why I did this is because I'm really big on framing the conversation, and it's very important to understand where we came from in order for us to understand where we're going or where we could be going. So that's why I wanted to lay it out from historical context like that. So the future of criminal justice system. States still look to build new jails and prison facilities, even as crime rates remain near historic lows. At the same time, Congress continues to advocate for new criminal statutes and higher criminal penalties, even as it proposes to lower some mandatory minimum sentences. A good example is the opioid crisis. At this point, if anybody is found in possession of drugs that contain fentanyl, I know that a lot of state legislatures and in the U.S. Congress, they're looking at applying mandatory minimums to those individuals. Even with all this information we have on how that doesn't work, they're still trying to do it. The overall goal and the bulk of resources should be devoted to keeping people out of the criminal justice system in the first place. So how do we go about doing that? Well, as you can see, I've listed on here some models that could help us to change that cycle that has been coming up over and over again in different manifestations. So for instance, decarcerate by divestment and reinvestment. This is the idea of divesting from giving funding, state and federal, to law enforcement and corrections. And instead of giving them that money, give that money to communities so that community resources can be used more effectively to address the underlying issues, such as substance abuse and addiction treatment, mental health treatment, youth services, reentry services. These are all services that are provided in communities that help people to stay out of the criminal justice system. But instead of investing in that, governments time and time again are investing more in corrections and policing, which all that does is encourage people to get incarcerated and locked up. It encourages criminalization. Proven preventative and restorative solutions. So preventative meaning alternatives to incarceration. I think a good example of this in Florida is the citation program. I think it's the police citation program that was passed into law in 2018. Right, that is a way to allow juveniles who commit a misdemeanor to instead of getting arrested by a law enforcement officer, give them an opportunity to engage in activities. And if they fulfill those activities within a certain amount of time, the officer will not process them. In other words, they will not be in the system. So if they ever get in trouble in the future or just get pulled over by an officer, and the officer does their check on their driver's license, they're not going to pop up. And that in itself is going to prevent a lot of situations and prevent people from being further incarcerated. An example of restorative solutions, restorative justice techniques. This has to do with educating people on accountability by having them learn about the impact of their actions, not only on themselves and their family, but even on the greater community. And then trying to have them engage in certain activities that will help them to learn accountability without them having to be incarcerated. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. Then there's the do no harm model. And what this is, it is more of a public health approach to the criminal justice system as opposed to a punitive approach. So in other words, how can we do as minimal amount of harm to individuals who are coming into the system, who are already in it, or who are leaving the system, to make sure that they do not get back into that system? How do we have more of a medicinal approach to the problem? And like I mentioned earlier, there are ways to do that through preventative measures. There's also community-based strategies. In other words, communities using the resources that are in those communities to try to address the underlying issues. And then there's innovative policing approaches. Now, I do want to put out there, because there is a growing trend in America, and probably globally as well, but I definitely know in the States, of communities who believe that they do not need to be policed. They can police themselves. And so I want to include that in innovative policing approaches, because that is something that is catching fire, and there are more communities that are starting to police themselves so that law enforcement has no involvement. Therefore, if there's an issue with somebody who's a drug addict or somebody suffering from mental illness, there are resources in that community that can address those issues. You don't need a law enforcement officer who's trained to use force and not trained to deal with people in crisis. You don't need them to engage with individuals who are in crisis or individuals struggling with addiction. You can't arrest your way out of the opioid crisis or even out of the war on drugs. That's not the approach. We have to treat it, similar like a doctor would treat a patient who's sick. And then there's trauma-informed care for individuals, families, and communities. And this is based off of the ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences model. Now what that model involves is, so the ACEs fits into 3 categories. One is abuse, the other is neglect, and the last one is household dysfunction. High doses of these traumas negatively impact a person's brain system, immune system, and hormonal system. And studies have shown that people exposed to very high doses of these traumas have reduced life expectancy. So it actually does have a physical impact on you, being exposed to those traumas. And so trauma-informed care addresses this. and it's all about how to address it with individuals, with families, and communities as a whole. So, all of these models that I just listed, they can manifest in several different ways. And so if you look at the list that I have below those lists, and I'm going to go through that right now, these are the different ways that it can manifest. Some of them have already manifested here in Florida in that way. So, for instance, you can privatize all related services. So all the services I mentioned, we're talking about divestment, reinvestment, divesting from corrections, divesting from law enforcement, and instead reinvesting in reentry services. That can be privatized. Reinvesting in youth services. That can be privatized. Reinvesting in drug treatment, drug addiction. That can be privatized. Reinvesting in mental health treatment. All of that can be privatized. So that's one model. Another model is the government control of operation of related services. Now that's our traditional model. Typically the government takes on the duty to do these kind of, to address these kind of issues. And then you have the more progressive model, which is community control and operation of related services. So this is where when you have community taking on that burden, utilizing the resources within the community to help its members out through coordination amongst all the different community groups, like a well-oiled machine. Then you also have community-private partnership. And this is where you have community members working with the private sector. And a good example of this could be individuals who are coming out from incarceration, they're looking for a job. Community-based organizations could work with private employers to try to create opportunities for those individuals. That's one way that that can show up. You also have government-private partnership, which I believe in Florida is, you see that a whole lot out here with the for-profit prison contracts. You also have community-government partnership. And I believe you see this as well in Florida. I know of certain groups and certain circuits throughout the state of Florida where you have community-based organizations that meet once a month with agencies such as the Department of Juvenile Justice, the Florida Department of Corrections, the Sheriff's Office, the Police Department, Public Defender, the State Attorney's Office. And what do? They meet once a month to talk about juveniles, young people who are about to leave DJJ, leave DOC, and re-enter society. And how can we make sure that when they come back home, that the services within their community are being provided to them and their families so that they're not going back to the same situation that led to them making that decision to commit crime. So therefore, if you're in a different situation, more than likely you're going to make a different decision. So you do see that. And then lastly, community, government, and private partnership. You have the private sector, the public sector, and the community-based organizations all working together in coordination on providing these services. Now, I'm not saying that any of these are right or any of them are wrong. I believe that it is specific to the community because there's never a one-size-fits-all when it comes to community. Every community has its own unique heritage, its own unique culture, and its own unique history. And all of that needs to be taken into consideration when you're talking about applying certain models and how it should be applied. However, there are three principles, in my opinion and from my experience, that if these three principles are applied, any of those models that I just listed for you will not only function well and successfully, but will do so over a sustainable, long-standing period of time. So it won't just happen within a year or 2 years or 10 years, it can happen over generations. So what are these three principles? Well, it's what I call the CAT approach. First, community empowerment. What does that mean? That means participation of community members in the decision-making processes. Second, accountability. Holding decision makers responsible for decisions and actions. Third, transparency. Data collection, analysis, and publication of disaggregated or broken down data by at least race, sex, and age. And If all of these three principles are adhered to consistently, it doesn't matter if you privatize all services, It doesn't matter if they're community run or if they're run by the government. They will always run successfully for a long period of time. In other words, this is how we can break that cycle that I mentioned earlier that continues to come up over and over again. Black codes, slave codes, Jim Crow, New Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the list goes on. How do we break it? By having a new approach, by having an innovative approach. And the CAT approach, in my opinion, is the best way to do that. So, let's talk about some good stuff. I want to talk about solutions and action. It's always good to talk about solutions, but it's even better to talk about groups and communities that are already implementing these actions and to hear about their successes. So let's do that. So there is the harm-free zone. The Spirit House in Durham, North Carolina established the harm-free zone to support a community-centered vision that helps repair the damage of racism and the oppression of poor people of color by providing tools and trainings to both strengthen and develop the capacity to prevent and confront and transform harm. The harm-free zone emphasizes independent and self-directing community autonomy as a necessary step towards creating shared collective accountability strategies and practice. And as you can see here, the harm-free zone uncovers and restores intervention practices existing within distinct communities to prevent or intervene in incidents of interpersonal conflict and state violence. It fosters intergenerational reciprocity within communities. It creates community-driven practices and policies that center the health, safety, and sustainability of our most vulnerable people. It also increases civic participation, right, voting rights, right, of disenfranchised community members directly impacted by poverty, criminalization, and the war on drugs. And lastly, it reduces and eventually eliminates community reliance on law enforcement. Remember I talked to you about there's a trend of communities divesting themselves of law enforcement and policing themselves. This is an example. It's already happening in Durham, North Carolina. And this is only the first of many. It's happening in other parts of America as well. So just keep it in mind. And some of the conditions necessary to create a harm-free zone, well, community investment. Have to have community investment. How well served is the community going to be able to do this? Where do you get the resources from? Has to be investment in the community. Ongoing democratic dialogue. Everybody's voice needs to be heard and considered, because everybody's a part of the community. Systemic analyses of oppression. Remember I said earlier, you need to know where you came from in order to know where you're going or where you could go. Agreed upon principles and practices. Everybody's on the same page, uniformity. Clear boundaries and roles, and vision and hope. Another example is the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund, also known as BCPF. The Brooklyn Community BCPF secures the freedom of New Yorkers who would otherwise be detained pre-trial due to their poverty alone. It is committed to challenging the criminalization of race, poverty, and immigration status, the practice of putting a price on fundamental rights, and the persistent myth that bail is a necessary element of the justice system. Since April of 2015, BCBF has paid bail for over 4,000 New Yorkers, effectively securing over 450 years of freedom. And I'll let you know right now, other communities around the country are modeling themselves off of this organization because of the great work that they do. Just keep that in mind. I know of some groups here in Florida, I know in Fort Lauderdale, there's a group that does that specifically for individuals who are LGBT that end up in the criminal justice system. They have a community bail fund from them. That's in Fort Lauderdale. BCBF joined with other community-based organizations, immigration advocates, and legal service services providers to form the New York Immigrant Freedom Fund, also known as NYIFF. Operated by BCBF, NYIFF secures the freedom of New Yorkers held in ICE detention who cannot afford to pay bond. So they're not only working on people that are U.S. citizens, but also helping people who are immigrants. When you're looking at everything going on right now, that is extremely important. So they do great work. Community restorative justice panels in Vermont. And the reason why I say in Vermont is because I used to be a panelist in Vermont on one of these community justice panels. And so, I mean, they happen all around the country. I'm sure they're happening here in Florida as well. But I can only speak on my experience, and so Vermont is that. It consists of teams of 3 to 5 volunteers who meet with justice involved in juveniles and victims of crimes to address the harm caused by low-level crimes in the community. They hold justice-involved juveniles accountable for the effects of their actions on others, discuss the circumstances and the impact of the crimes, and the ways that justice-involved juveniles can avoid making similar actions in the future. Cases are referred by the police department. The criminal court is part of the sentencing order signed by the judge or the state attorney's office. An attempt is made to contact victims in every case, and a victim liaison volunteer keeps the victim informed of progress throughout the case. So everybody's involved in the process. Nobody's excluded. And that's how you restore justice to the community, by making sure everybody's on the same page and have that open dialogue and communication. My experience on being on the panel is that victims who participated, a lot of times I felt that it was an eye-opening situation for them to hear the background of the juvenile and to see their situation with their family where they have a mother and father who's barely at home because they're working 3 jobs. And so that juvenile, that young person, at 1 a.m. is out hanging out with their friends because they have nobody at home there to supervise them. Because their parents are trying to work so that they can pay bills and take care of their kid. And when victims saw that, it was an eye-opener, and it made them feel like, okay, I really don't want to lock this kid up. I want to give this kid an opportunity. And some of them ended up becoming friends with the same kids who committed the crime against them. Very, very successful program. And then let's come here in Florida. We have some good news here in Florida as well. I don't know if there's any members of Peace for Tarpon in the audience, but that is a wonderful organization that do great work up in Tarpon Springs. This Peace for Tarpon initiative, which is a grassroots effort and looks through a trauma-informed lens to seek the root causes of our most challenging issues rather than addressing the symptoms. Its mission is to promote trauma-sensitive community and foster healing. It does this by connecting residents and service providers to available resources. Remember I talked about a community-based strategy approach, where all of the resources within the community are well coordinated like a well-oiled machine, and they're coordinating with each other to make sure to provide services to the most vulnerable in that population, in their community. And it also informs citizens and professionals on research that shows direct causes and outcomes of adverse childhood and adult experiences, as we know, is also trauma. It transforms communal and personal attitudes toward health, renewal, resolution, resilience, and compassion. And it heals people, systems, and communities through trauma-informed prevention practices and resolution methods. It is a wonderful program. I did great work with them when I was at Southern Poverty Law Center, and very happy that they're doing work in Florida. I know that I think Sarasota is trying to do something similar as well. So I'm very happy about that as well. I'm very happy to hear that. And now, I'm kind of bringing it full circle because I recently moved to Chicago, Illinois. And so, of course, I had to bring up an example of some good work happening in Illinois as well. So we have the Peoria Public Schools Wraparound Center. So this center provides workspace at the Truman Middle School in Peoria, Illinois, for organizations addressing a variety of needs. It connects families to wraparound services quickly and efficiently. It ensures that families in crisis who frequently do not have transportation will find help under one roof. And it has a trauma recovery center that serves the trauma recovery needs of victims of violent crime, including students and their families. In addition to the trauma recovery, the Schumann Middle School, in partnership with 19 community organizations, offers services in a wide range of areas that I have listed here. I'll read it out. Physical, mental, and emotional health and wellness, basic needs such as food, clothing, housing assistance, access to technology and transportation, financial education, job search assistance, adult education, parenting classes, before and after school programs, and summer and school intercession programs, college and career transition assistance, and finally, safety and justice services, including legal aid, probation and parole services, and personal safety training. That's a lot to have under one roof. Now, I had my new job, I had gone on a tour of this facility, and it is absolutely amazing. The person who runs it, an African-American gentleman, he said that the number one thing that attracts people in the community to that wraparound center is their food pantry. Because at the end of the day, people have to eat. So people are not going to go there to say, oh, can you help me out with some legal services? Can you help me out with trauma recovery? No, they go there because they want to eat. And when they're going there to pick up food, then they notice all of these other services that are nearby, all under one roof. And it's like, oh, well, that actually sounds like that can help me too. Let me just walk next door and learn more about it. But it's the food that brings them there. So it's very important. I like the way that they think and how they do this. So, to finish off, in conclusion, just as I said earlier about life consisting of cycles that keep on remanifesting themselves in different forms over time, talking about the slave codes and black codes and mass incarceration and Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow. We continue to see history repeat itself in a different form, but still targeting and incarcerating the most vulnerable populations, and especially communities of color. However, I believe that there's light at the end of the tunnel, especially when you look at what communities have done in taking ownership of the resources in those communities. And I believe, in my opinion, that as more communities do this, and also as more communities apply and adhere to consistently the CAT approach, don't forget community empowerment, accountability, and transparency, that we will create a new cycle. A cycle of healing, a cycle of do no harm, and a cycle of no more racism. No, seriously. That's what I hope for at the end of the day. But that's going to take everybody working together to do it right. Like I said, it doesn't have to be community-based. It can even be privatized off services, but you need to make sure that the community is always involved in all the decision-making, that there's always accountability for those who make the decision, and that there's always transparency about what's happening. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate everything that you've said. And just to let you know, my son is not African American, but he just got out of jail. And without any resources, is living in his truck. So it's not an easy thing. I just want to make you aware, and everyone aware, that the Tarpon Springs initiative that you mentioned, Sarasota is taking it on. And we have initiative that started, a grassroots initiative that's called Sarasota Strong. It's countywide, and it's to create trauma-informed communities. And I have information if you'd like it on what that looks like. And we hold forums once a month, one in Sarasota, 1 month, and the next month we're in Venice. And we're just starting a new leadership team of people in South County to really get an energy growing here. But I do want to mention that Sarasota Strong is presenting a day of building a community in hope and healing, addressing trauma and building resilience at Selby Gardens. Father Paul Abernathy from Pittsburgh, who has been working 6 years in Pittsburgh on this kind of initiative, will be speaking, and if anybody would like to know more about that. And then just one more thing that is coming up. There is a training called Emotional CPR, and it's around how to be with people in crisis and support them and gain the skills, and so I have information about that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for an excellent talk. I feel as if I learned a lot. I read Just Mercy last year, and I read The New Jim Crow just a few months ago. And those were both very, very informative. One of the things that both of those books led me to do is to look into this whole issue more. And one of the things that puzzles me, perhaps we can address this, the Prison Reform Act that was passed just recently, maybe a year ago, in the federal government, called First Step, really delivered a lot of reforms in the prison system. It was a bipartisan bill, strongly endorsed by the president. There was a second bill coming, Second Step, that's been initiated by Cory Booker. You didn't mention either of those. Do you feel that they're not effective enough, or that just too little drops in the ocean?
Well, main reason I didn't mention them was mainly because when you look at everything else that's happening under this administration, it almost seems as if whatever they do in that regard is not going to have much of an effect, because it's counterbalanced by all the other actions, all the other adverse actions. So in my opinion, I think it's more important to focus on what they're doing that's increasing mass incarceration or allowing it to continue, than what they're trying to make it seem like they're doing to address mass incarceration. I'll be honest, I don't know about Cory Booker's Second Step Act. It really hasn't caught on, in government yet. I think it's just a conversation for that. But the First Step Act, from what I've read on it and the results of it, it seems like it's more for show rather than what it actually does for the community.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir?
Thank you again. Great historical perspective and the balance of the overwhelming problem, but with models of opportunity. Are you aware, because so many people get their sources of information from the media, of best practice models that address media on how there's many different ways they can report on something, just like there's many ways that police could respond, or but where the media are there best practice models that work with the media and informing them about how they report on criminal justice issues. By the way, I come from Detroit, so
nice.
Yeah.
Yes, well, I know of a nonprofit organization that does great work around messaging on criminal justice reform. It's called the Opportunity Agenda. And what I would recommend is checking out their website. I know that they've also created a number of toolkits for communities and also for the press and media for how they go about describing incidents, especially when they talk about who is the alleged victim and who's the alleged perpetrator. All of that. I'd say it's in particular when you're talking about officer-involved incidents, where a lot of times the person who's killed by the officer is not seen as the victim, they're seen as the perpetrator. And pictures that they post up of them are not their best pictures. It's not like them at church or them graduating from high school. it's usually them looking like they're going to try to start trouble with somebody, and it's not accurate at all.
What was the name of that again?
The Opportunity Agenda. They've been around for several years. They do great work around messaging, media messaging.
Thank you.
In relation to our penal system, I was wondering, have they looked at models of other countries throughout the world? What I'm thinking is about a year ago on National Public Television, they showed a documentary, and I think it was in the Netherlands. When people go to prison, the prison is a place, it's not that they're, I mean, they have their cells and so forth, but it's almost like an enormous farm. And during the day, I mean, their cells, the doors are not closed. During the day, they work and they're free to come and go as they please. And what they found over a period of time, the prisoners changed their mind. And when the time came for them to leave, they were really ready to go back into the world, changed people. And they interviewed quite a few of them, and they said, okay, when you move out, why are you not, what's the reason you're not going to go back to committing crimes again? And their answer was, I've been shown a better way to live. I've been given my freedom in here that allows me, and I've seen what I've been missing in my life. So when I do get my freedom, I go back out there. I don't want to come back in here. I was just wondering, in this country, have we looked at other models of other countries throughout the world that maybe are doing it better than we are?
Yes, and some of the models that I mentioned, like the public health model, restorative justice, preventative measures, I believe all those models were modeled after work that's been done in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And not only in like Europe, but even with tribal organizations. Because I know, like for instance, restorative circles, that originated with indigenous people. I don't like to say indigenous, First Nation people. And so that was something that we then adopted, and now we use that, like the restorative justice panel I mentioned in Vermont. That's based off of that concept, which has been used for centuries by Native Americans and other First Nation people around the world. So we do it, it's just a matter of what we invest in. Like you can do something, but if you don't invest a lot in it, you're just doing a little bit of it. What we do invest in, as I showed you earlier, is law enforcement and corrections. So we invest more in locking people up and keeping them locked up than we do in trying to address the underlying issues which would prevent them from being incarcerated in the first place, which is what other countries have already, even in Europe, have already come to that conclusion, and they've been practicing that for decades. So, yeah.
Thank you.
What do you think the private prison systems will do to ensure their survival as incarceration rates fall?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. So, if you want me to give my perspective on that, what I think has already started happening is that I know back in 2013 that CCA, that was one of the groups that I mentioned before, Civic is what they're called now, and GEO Group, they were already looking, or they already changed their portfolio for where they're investing their time and money and energy. And so for them, instead of investing in jails and in prisons so much, they already started seeing the trend in the U.S. population toward decarceration. So what they've done is they've changed their portfolio to focus more on services. So for instance, services that would prevent you from being incarcerated, or once you come out of incarceration, to keep you from getting reincarcerated, like reentry services. They've already started privatizing reentry services and establishing that through for-profit contracts. Mental health services, addiction and substance abuse treatment. So all of these services are already privatized to some extent. And what they've been doing is they've been trying to get ahead of the mark by investing in that now. So by the time the decarceration movement is at full effect and full swing, and we're starting to see fewer and fewer prisons and fewer jails being utilized, now you're going to have more people, in my opinion, who are going to be what I would call incarcerated in their communities. Remember I mentioned earlier about the community supervision? And remember that idea about the electronic monitoring system? $750 a month? Right. So already you're seeing those groups investing in that technology. because they know that at the end of the day, as prisons and jails are abolished, there's still, we're still going to have to find a way to keep people that are engaging in improper behavior, keep an eye on them, to survey them. And the best way to do that is with technology. And so what they're doing is they're investing in those technologies and they're selling those technologies to governments, state, local, and federal government. So ultimately what I think is going to happen is you're going to start to see people incarcerated in their communities, and it's going to be based on their zip code. So you'll have certain zip codes in which the population within that zip code will consist almost entirely of people who have records, or people who were involved in the justice system somehow. So kids, parents, grandparents, all of them. So there will be no more locking up of people. Yay! But still the same thing, just manifesting, remember that cycle, in a different form. So I mean, that's what I think is going to happen. I mean, for-profit prisons are already there, already investing in it, and they're just waiting for the cards to fall in place.
That's scary.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds as though you're against the death penalty. I'm a proponent. I'm in favor of the death penalty. I know it's been abused in the past, but it is really an effective tool for district attorneys. There's a lot of bodies that have been found when the district attorney has negotiated with somebody who's killed somebody to help them find the body. If they take the death penalty off the person who's done the crime, is sometimes, most of the time, will say, I'll show you the body. And it helps families deal with it a little bit better.
Yes, so were you asking me?
I just make the impression you're against the death penalty, and I'm just telling you I'm in favor for those reasons.
Right. Well, I see where you're coming from. The reason why I'm against it is the way that it's implemented. It tends to be used a lot of times to not only incarcerate African American men, but find a way to pretty much completely take us out of our communities and control us, similar to the Black codes. And that's why when you look at the data, I mean, if you have somebody of color who was killed, more than likely that the person who killed them is not going to be put on the death penalty. But if it's a white person, they are. So, I mean, if that system was implemented differently, then I might have a different perspective on it.
It's even black cops and white cops, they all have the same new approach.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.